Everybody leaving a job should have an exit interview. It's a good exercise for the employee and for the organization, a way to think about what's happened. There's too much to think about in a 25-minute sermon about a 29-year-long job, but I wanted to hit the highlights and to remind us all in these heady days that nothing that happened here was done alone. This is not the end of my ministry. This is the end of our ministry. And we have a lot to remember and celebrate. So I'll be joined by some of the leaders from different eras of my ministry. The second to last sermon of mine, this one is also going to be the longest, but don't worry, it's all going to work out.
Well, Christine, I was on the committee that brought Christine here in 1988, and that was a long time ago. Just to remind you, Ronald Reagan was president. Postage stamp cost 24 cents. The Dow Jones average was 2,100, not 21,000. And the top movies were Rain Man, Die Hard, and A Fish Called Wanda. Our committee did its work with phone calls and letters. There was no Skype, email, internet, Twitter and Facebook hadn't even been thought of. One thing our committee knew was that the congregation had a really wide range of tastes. In particular, some were really happy with the intellectual sermons and the classical music, which had been the congregation's style of worship. But there wasn't much singing, meditating, or a ritual of any sort. And there was a substantial group of mostly women who had been introduced by a past minister's wife to some women's spirituality and the more emotional side of worship, and who were very keen on having that expressed in our worship service. We also knew we had a kind of headstrong congregation and staff, to put it mildly, and we knew we needed a strong leader. Christine seemed to us to really fit the bill because her sermons were very strongly intellectual, but she had also worked with her first congregation on a worship service that was more like worship than a lecture or a concert. We worked hard to convince her to interview with us. She didn't want to move west of the Mississippi, and she wasn't even sure that we were ready for a change in worship style. We convinced her to interview with us on her way to General Assembly in California. And that was the first step in what turned out to be 29 years of ministry here at First Unitarian. I take great pride and satisfaction that the committee did its work so well. So, Christine, what really changed your mind? What did you see in us besides a bunch of misfits?
Well, actually, first of all, I was very impressed by such a determined search committee. And because I've always found that going with the flow rather than stubbornly following one's own plans keeps life interesting, I agreed to come and visit. And when I got off the plane, and speaking of how long ago this was, you got off the plane by going down the steps and walking across the tarmac. And I got off that plane and looked up at the mountains and was awestruck by how beautiful they were. And I thought, what a beautiful place. I'm so glad I came to visit. And then I thought, I could live here? And then I was impressed by the committee's stories about a congregation which seemed able to negotiate change. They told me, for instance, about a conflict between the people who were perfectly happy with the habit of applauding the musicians, mostly symphony players, who played for the services in those days, and those who found that off-putting, creating what they called the concert lecture show. They told me about a congregational meeting in which this dispute was hashed out and a compromise arrived at, that there would be the first couple of pieces of music would have applause, and then the chalice would be lit, the chalice being also a new innovation. And after that, there would be no applause. I was really impressed by a community which could offer different needs in that way. And then, well, I just fell in love, though I still had some questions. When I left here after the weekend and went to General Assembly, the UUA staff person in the position of the regional lead, who had known this congregation from its beginnings in the 1950s, told me in detail how each of the previous ministers had, well, let's say, missed the mark. He was a little over the top about it, actually, and it made it a little hard to believe it all. I figured there was another side to the story, and even if all the fault had laid originally with the ministers, after all those years and all those difficulties, the congregation was not likely to be in a good place. At the end of his recitation, he leaned in and said this to this 35-year-old youngster, "Do you know what all this means?" "Yes," I said, "it means it will take some time for them to trust me." And he got this surprised look on his face, and then he said, "Well, if you understand that, then I think you should go. I think you just might be able to do something with them. It was such a promising church at the beginning. Yes, you go, and when you get your feet on the ground, you give me a call, and I will tell you the rest." Oh, just wait. So it was years and years later, remembering that first conversation, that I thought three things. First, I realized I had been somewhat foolish to think that this man really knew me very well or much about my skills and abilities after talking at me for an hour. And I shouldn't have assumed that because the great Russ Lockwood thought I was equal to this job, I really was. Secondly, I came to wonder what he had thought I meant by some time. Because I'd been thinking about 3 years, and actually it was almost 15. And thirdly, I remembered what a relief it had been to know that I would have an advisor to help me navigate the difficulties which were very easy to anticipate. And I remembered what a shock it was to hear 2 years later that he had been suddenly taken ill and had died. So I came the next fall, knowing that it was possible, even likely, that I would run into enough issues with all this past history and mixed expectations that it would be a pretty short ministry. And that if that's what the congregation needed, I figured I could supply it and go my way. And it nearly turned out that way, more than once. But I was going to learn that a congregation that had stolidly weathered issues with all of its ministers was not only prone to act like the foster child, always testing the foster parents' love, but also it was sturdy and streetwise and had a will to live. And that's what kept us going for quite a while. The first 13 years of my ministry were interesting. Hard work. We went through several pretty miserable periods. Rod and Judy Groves were two of many lay leaders who weathered those with me. We all have our scars.
Well, Rod and I came here in 1995. Okay. We were birthright Unitarians. We are birthright Unitarians. And most recently, we came from a small fellowship in central Illinois. And so we were anxious to join this big church where everything would run smoothly and we wouldn't have to do anything anymore. But then we started hearing things, rumors. There was a big fight. And about a significant number, a whole lot of people had left the congregation following the leadership of the minister, or I don't mean minister, I mean the administrator or the music director, or maybe both of them. And it was a really hard time. They left in a huff because of this new, young woman minister. Anyway, not surprisingly, all this was replete with a bunch of unpleasantness, difficult congregational meetings, and the formation of a separate fellowship in Nob Hill.
But it seemed to us that the congregation was comparatively healthy, even robust by the standards we'd been through in the past. The congregation had actually grown quite a bit in recent years, about 25%. And that in itself might have caused some of the stresses and strains, we thought. Something that a consultant who had come to help work through the crisis pointed out. She encouraged the congregation to turn its attention to what we wanted to be, something positive, where we wanted to go. In other words, to long-range planning. So a long-range planning committee had been set up, and it boiled down our mission issue to two alternatives. One, shall we move to a location that will better serve the whole metropolitan area, including the west side? Or two, shall we stay put right where we are, renovate, and help a new congregation to form on the west side? In the end, we decided to stay, renovate the property, and help start the new congregation, which is now the West Side congregation. Asked to be on the board, that's where I came in. My thoughts were, surely such a mission won't be much of a task for a congregation of 500 people. An architect was hired and a plan developed for remodeling our decrepit religious education space, building a new administrative facility, and in addition, a new social hall. And then we kicked off a capital fund drive. Turned out that the congregation had not raised capital funds in a long time, and our efforts fell short, far short. So we held another drive, and that too left us short. Then what to do? Christine and board chair Sarah Friedrich seized the bull by the horns, proposing that half a loaf was better than no loaf at all. We got a mortgage, scaled back the project to the administrative quarters and the RE building, and then cobbled together enough nickels and dimes to remodel our original sanctuary into a very modest but functional social hall adjoined by a memorial garden and memorial wall. Certainly less than what we wanted, but not bad considering all the limitations.
But that wasn't the totality of our challenges, not by a long shot. Our administrator of 6 years, a really nice guy, and with lots of friends in the congregation, seemed less and less capable of handling the increasingly complicated task of administering the congregation. And so it was decided that he had to go. Of course, everyone, or not everyone, but there were a lot of people that blamed Christine for this. And we were in the painful process of more angry people and more meetings and so forth and so on. And on top of this, we were broke. With no funds, we couldn't hire a new administrator. And so, without too much thought, I volunteered. No sooner had I done this than Christine became seriously ill and was out of the office. The accountant, the part-time accountant, resigned and took with her her accounting system. And others left, and it was pretty bad, but the congregation certainly had my back. Member after member volunteered to help out. And it wasn't just answering phones. It was setting up a new accounting system. It was getting out the newsletter. It was figuring out a new way to organize the office. It was having the Sunday, or setting up the Sunday guys to open and close the the church on Sundays, and also to deal with the workmen and the janitors and the outside workmen. So anyway, it was a big job. And frankly, I was really happy when we did finally hire a new administrator and I could step down.
Of course, all the tumult caused us once again to knock on the door of the UUA and ask for a consultant. A consultant came out and told us that we had to figure out a better way of managing our staff. Yes. That boards of churches of our size just couldn't supervise staff alone. He told us that we should trust our minister to do that. And barring that, we should bring in an associate minister to head the staff. But we were broke. We couldn't even hire an administrator at that point, as Judy has said. So I and 2 other board members formed an administrative council, which together with Christine tried to supervise the staff. Yikes. Double yikes. What misery. Awful. Where did I get it? Why did I ask for this? Even when we made all these decisions, if a staff person left unhappy or even left, there began mumblings again about Christine creating an impossible work environment. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, some days the reverse. And on top of that, Christine got sick. But I'll let her tell that part. Anyway, Christine, how did you get through all of that?
Well, not always well. It wasn't easy, and the stress was at least one part of a set of health challenges I had in the late 90s. 3 cancer scares, one of which turned out to be real, a serious illness, 4 surgeries in 4.5 years. Yikes again. And for a while, I felt like I was walking around angry all the time. And then I felt like I was walking around depressed all the time. Time to get some help, which I did. And a good thing, too, because we had one final go-around about staff management. Somewhere in those years, I came across my watchwords by the Czech politician Václav Havel. I share them with you because they seem so relevant to these days, for all of us, to our larger world. Havel wrote this: "There is only one way to strive for democracy, reason, responsibility, sincerity, civility, and tolerance, and that is decently, responsibly, reasonably, sincerely, civilly, and tolerantly." I am aware, he wrote, that in everyday politics, this is not seen as the most practical way. But it worked in the end. In the end, we had 3 rounds of conflict about staff management. But in between, we had really good times of good work together. We restructured to support our growth from 400 to 500 members. The mission covenant process resulted in a useful document which has guided us ever since. We dealt with those long-time building issues, and we learned to raise money. I was so impressed and touched that this congregation was willing to extend itself financially to start the West Side congregation. We supported their first minister to the tune of $35,000 that we didn't really have. And besides all that good ministry, the congregation was, when it wasn't mad at me, genuinely loving towards me. They celebrated Kevin's birth and showered him with love. They brought casseroles after all those surgeries. You filled my mailbox with cards when I was diagnosed with cancer. And never, not once, no matter how much tension there was with me, and there was a lot at times, did anybody ever take it out on William or Kevin. Not all ministers with families can say that, and I'm glad I can. There were times when I thought I really should leave for the sake of the congregation, not to mention for the sake of me and my family. It's not good for congregations to fight like this. But each time, and there were 3, I realized that it would be really hard to leave. I had an infant. I was uninsurable. Remember those days? Thank you, Mr. Obama. And in 2001, that fateful year, the tide really started to turn. We had a flood of visitors and new members after 9/11. By 2003, we had 600 members, and it was really a different congregation than the one I'd come to 15 years earlier. And that's when both the sustained work and the sustained fun really started. But before year 15, well, it was checkered work and not much fun, and I discovered my inner resilience. Maybe I learned it from the church, which had endured so much over the years and was still here to tell the tale. And with that in mind, this song the band is about to sing means a lot to me.
Day dawns, and I am practicing my purpose once again. It is fresh and it is fruitful if I win, but if I lose, oh, I don't know. I'll be tired, but I will turn and I will go. Only guessing till I get there, then I'll know. Oh, I will know. All the children walking home past the factories can see the light that's shining in my window as I write this song to you. And all the cars running fast along the interstate can feel the love that radiates, illuminating what I know is true. All will be well, even after all the promises you've broken to yourself. All will be well. You can ask me how, but only time will tell. The winter's cold, but the snow still slightly settles on the trees. And a mess is still a moment I can seize until I know that all will be well. Even though sometimes this is hard to tell, and the fight is just frustrating as hell, all will be well. And all the children walking home past the factories can see the light that's shining in my window as I write this song to you. And all the cars running fast along the interstate can feel the love that radiates, illuminating what I know is true. All will be well, even after all the promises you've broken to yourself. All will be well. You can ask me how, but only time will tell. You gotta keep it up, don't give up. Chase your dreams and you will find all in time. And all the children walking home past the factory, you see the light illuminating, shining in our window as I write this song to you. And all the cars running fast along the interstate can feel the love that radiates, illuminating what I know is true. All will be well, even after all the promises you've broken to yourself. All will be well. You can ask me how, but only time will tell. All will be well, even after all the promises you've broken to time will tell. You can ask me how, but only time will tell.
W was inaugurated as president in 2001, and none of us had cell phones. Mary and I joined the congregation that year, and I was on the board from 2003 to 2006. During those years, the congregation was living out a decision it had made in 2001. The church was growing. After trying various ways of managing with existing staff levels, the congregation took a risk. It voted to hire an associate minister with an administrative specialty. That involved drawing down every penny of the congregation's financial reserves and increasing our pledging by 1/3 over the next 3 years. But we achieved that goal handily. We had Jim Zacharias with us for 2 years to establish the position.
Ministers are mostly trained to be solo practitioners, and most congregations only have one. So 2 ministers is a learning curve for all parties. When Jim left as scheduled, we called David Grimm. Our first intern, Meredith Garman, was with us in 2003, and we even had an ordained director of religious education at that time. And just in time, too, all that extra staff, because suddenly we had 600 members. And we were learning that this was not just a matter of adjusting to a little more growth, but rather of adjusting to the bursting through a glass ceiling. Everything was different.
Your life must have changed. What were you learning?
Sometimes people ask me if I didn't get bored staying with the same job for so long. And I tell them that actually I've really had at least 3 jobs. Just all at the same address, and with some of the same people. Learning to work with colleagues was really a very interesting, almost spiritual discipline. I realized that you have to have what I now think of as a Goldilocks ego. Not too big, not too small, just right. And something else happened, which seemed to me to be just magic. All that scapegoating energy, all that, well, it must be Christine's fault, which had so plagued us from the very beginning. Plagued us so much that I had a friend that even made me a little ceramic scapegoat of my very own so I could take my frustrations out on somebody. When there were 2 ministers, it evaporated, never to be seen again. And that was very wonderful.
The congregation had a great experience with our first intern, and I was excited that we would be able to have at least 5 more. Dave and I each served on 2 intern committees. We found it very interesting to see how people become ministers, and very satisfying to feel that we were helping with the progress. So, Christine, what were you learning?
What was I teaching?
Teaching.
Yes, it was a little of both. So one thing about ministry is that it's a profession you bring your whole self to. An old-fashioned name for the minister is the parson. And in the end, the parson means the person writ large, or the person with special authority. So there are things to teach about ministry. I did, for instance, teach Andrew, our most scholarly preacher, to add humor to his sermons, and it was a great pleasure to learn that he remembered that last week. But what most young ministers need to learn most is not techniques. It's how to be their own best kind of minister, and the only way to teach that is to be doing it yourself. What the interns did for me was to help me stay growing in ministry. And I will be forever grateful to a congregation which embraced being a teaching congregation and loved and supported all of our interns so well. Because another important thing that makes a good minister is a good congregation.
Christine, the video ministry and the branch projects were part of those years too.
Yes. We had a handful of members driving long distances to come to church, and some from the same little towns, some of whom didn't even know each other before they met each other here. And when I came across the branch strategy that evangelical Christians were using for their own purposes, I thought, well, you know, that would be a perfect way to give folks in small towns around New Mexico a chance to be a part of a UU congregation in their own towns, which were just too small to ever support a UU presence. I wasn't by this time so surprised when everybody from our musicians to our geeky guys to our board was excited about this idea, even though I said it could change everything. A congregation which will make space, after all, for 200 new members and support a new congregation could take something like this on with enthusiasm, and you did. We got a grant from the UUA for startup costs, and now we have 2 well-developed branches in Socorro and Edgewood, and a model for other congregations to follow. And we've discovered many uses for the videos we make each week, from the family room in the foyer to La Vida Llena, and they're used by many individuals, and they're pirated considerably by the small congregations off of our YouTube site. So thanks, video team.